I was serious. You guys, you three can ask each other questions, but how about from the audience? What do we got? Right here.
He doesn't need a microphone.
We're nonpartisan, but this is mainly to our two business leaders, but also Nick, you can weigh in. But does it make any difference to you, really, who gets elected president in 2012?
Dave, you go first. Can you turn the camera off, please? When I look at it from a business perspective, no. I mean, honestly, I think Carl said it earlier, so did I. We figure out ways to work around almost every issue we see because having a business in 140 countries, who runs that one of the countries, just in a grand scheme of things, doesn't materially matter to us because those policies don't affect, at least from a high-tech viewpoint, as much as, I think some of the press or media might make it out to be. So for us as a global citizen, probably no. That would be my answer. Carl,
I would totally agree with Dave.
But it makes for fun reading.
Nick, how about it if you was a recent arrival here?
I still don't get to vote, although I'm of course taxed. Which I don't know. I think I'm going to defer from the businessmen on this much more. I mean, it's interesting that the firms they're running are much more global, I guess. So in part, you can escape bad policy at home. Coming back, I'm going to come back to what we were discussing earlier. There's a big issue, I think, between small and large firms. For large firms, to some extent, you can arbitrage by moving across countries. For some of small firms, and I guess firms involved in government, it's a big issue, but it's not something that I should stay out of this. I'm so far only allowed to vote on the other side of the Atlantic.
So let me just say I don't take strong positions politically, but I would say that something that is likely to happen in the next administration is comprehensive tax reform, and it probably would come out differently with a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. Although I think we're not very likely to have one party that's effectively in control. In fact, even if the Republicans were to take the Senate and the presidency, I still don't think it would be an easy for the president to get their way with the divisions in the Republican Party. So, but I do think that the tax reform is on the agenda for the next 4 years, and so I think there's some stakes in that, depending on how you'd like it to come out, because we know that the two parties differ, and at the extremes, one party favors a flat tax, and the other favors a tax the rich kind of tax, and it makes a difference, I suppose.
I'll just add on one comment, John. Something I was amazed at was I had a chance to have a lot more interaction with the White House the last couple of years from my security point of view. And it was really interesting to watch the current president's knowledge curve grow as much as it had from the first couple of months in office to just recently. We had a meeting. I'm on the National Security Advisory Council now. And it was interesting to watch. And it's like anything in life, you learn a lot as you go. And it's really interesting how steep that learning curve is. I'm sure Carl was the same way. When you first become a CEO or an executive in any way, it's a huge learning curve. But it was interesting to watch that. And I think that's true for a lot of things through the administration as they learn, as they go. But they'll be much more seasoned if they do get elected again. So it's an interesting intangible.
Yes, here in front.
Take us through what the worst scenario looks like for a cybersecurity attack, and how well you think we are prepared to respond to it.
Is that voice of God? Like, where was Oh, sorry. The worst case scenario of a cyber attack? Wow. This keeps me up at night a lot, I would tell you, and I think it does the president and others at this point. I'm sure a lot of you have read some of the activities we've seen. We've really watched a landscape around the world where not only do we see crime reaching tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, just cyber crime, but we've seen the advent of terrorism and nation-state attacks that are reaching levels that the world has never seen before. We have almost no policies. We have almost no global way to resolve it. One country and another country just have no mechanism to dispute it. Intellectual property theft from one country to another is extremely rampant at this point. And the access to toolkits that can bring down critical infrastructure is sold on eBay today. So you just need a motivated party, and you can perpetrate an amazing attack that, you know, we worry could be as big, if not bigger, than 9/11 or beyond, to bring down critical infrastructure, air traffic control systems, smart grid electrical systems. They're all IP addressable. Denial of service attacks into that infrastructure are very doable at this point. So, you know, that's what keeps people up at night from a cyber point of view, is watching the imbalance that we've created of offense and defense. The offense cost is very low. To build a plutonium enrichment plant, to build a nuclear weapon, costs, you know, huge sums of money. To get a denial of service kit to bring down the infrastructure of America costs hardly anything. So to watch that, it's a pretty amazing situation we're in. We need to resolve it, quite frankly. It's one of the biggest concerns I think everyone has right now, is watching these types of activities, at least from my vantage point. Yes.
Yeah. So if we look at the U.S. Labor market or employment market, it's pretty much we just experienced the so-called lost decade. Basically, the non-farm payroll last month was exactly the same as March 2000, 11 years ago. So, but when we dig deeper into the data, we can see the non-manufacturing payroll actually increased slightly, but manufacturing declined by 1/3. So it's kind of, without the sharp decline of manufacturing-related jobs, U.S. unemployment rate would be like 4.9% instead of 9% last month. So this is kind of more like a structural problem because of the globalization, technology, and so forth. I don't know whether you guys have any experts, any kind of suggestion or solution besides the long-term education, which can match the skills and demand much better. But sometimes that's the long-term issue, and most politicians are worried about the next election. And another one could be to nurture some new technology so we can migrate, because some of the industry loss will be permanent. There's no way we can get them back, but we can nurture the new technology. But how can we avoid the surrender trust problem, sometimes the policy interfere in a certain new technology getting us into the trouble because the regulation, the government involvement.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would say about manufacturing, I'll tell you two sides of the story. One is I recently went to Detroit. I was in one of our customers, biggest transmission plant in the world. It's now running 3 shifts. American car manufacturers are doing well again. It's that kind of story that accounts for corporate profits. The parking lot at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning is 2/3 empty. That's all the people that work there anymore. This was a plant that was built around World War II. It was intended to have that side of workforce. It doesn't need that kind of workforce. It's almost a lights-out factory, and transmissions are coming off the line every 2 minutes. And so you're watching this fully automated thing. The people in there's a handful of people kind of just diagnosing problems. So on one hand, I think that's the big problem that you have, as much so as, you know, labor arbitrage of cheap labor across the world. On the other hand, what I'm starting to see is with the introduction of computers into the manufacturing process, we're now able to create things at very low prices in small volumes and incredibly high quality. And what you need to do is, so I see a flourishing of small manufacturing companies even companies who have, small companies who started by outsourcing jobs are moving them onshore for quality, reliability, ease of communication, and they're taking advantage of new manufacturing techniques to do it. The problem I see is that it's more medium term because these are jobs that are being created in firms with 20 and 30 employees. And at the other time, you're taking a transmission plant and you're gutting the employees.
You know, I'm kind of out of my field here, but and Nick can bail me out maybe. But what I thought when the Fed was doing its QE1s and its QE2s, and interest rates were already zero or roughly zero, and I was kind of trying to figure out, you know, how is this going to work? And I concluded that, even though it's never announced, but basically this was a weak dollar policy. This is a policy to drive the dollar down and therefore reinvigorate manufacturing and exports. And Nick, maybe you can help me out, but I don't know if I'm even on the right track, but that's, in a way, I thought that was really the policy to help manufacturing and help the U.S. exports. But you just can't come out and say, what we're following here is a weak dollar policy. But that's what they were doing.
I mean, I was going to say, if you mentioned picking key sectors. I mean, unfortunately, most of the evidence from around the world for governments that tried to pick winners has been pretty bad. So the Japanese went for a lot of kind of artificial intelligence, and the French, for example, the French, a country I guess the British always like to pick on, did a lot of nuclear stuff, was again not successful. If you look at what the US has done very well at, it's innovative industries coming out, a lot of it from universities. So we were kind of talking briefly afterwards, but you know, Stanford and Berkeley and high tech, and a lot of the biotech on the East Coast. So, and that's something that Europe has been poor at, traditionally not very good at. It doesn't have these elite universities. So in terms of, I think, you know, picking fields, the government does very badly at it. What seems to work well is government stepping back, encouraging research-intensive universities and giving people incentives to, you know, invest in venture and create startups, and that's been obviously very successful. So, you know, the Chinese are still going down primarily the picking winners scenario. I just don't see it being very successful. I think, you know, markets and incentivized scientists are just a better way to go.
Okay, let's see how you did over dinner.
Yeah, just separate from your comments that you've made about creating products and serving customers and hiring workers, I'm curious if, as heads of public companies, you have any thoughts about sort of the globalization of capital markets and how America is either still competitive or how we're competing versus other financial markets around the world where regulations may be different if you needed to raise capital or either equity or debt.
I mean, I would still go look to American markets for it. Now, the American market is the administrator, but a lot of the money is coming from other parts of the world, and I think you have to deal with that dichotomy. But, you know, I don't see a lot of movement right now where there's a great need for American companies or American-based companies to go outside the U.S. markets. They still seem to compete very effectively. There's a huge pool of capital. So I see that. I do sometimes wonder, though, about us falling behind. So I have one little pet peeve. You know, it's interesting in running a public company. You know, if I ask a public company CEO, what do you do, is you serve the interest of the shareholders, you build shareholder value. And here's just one small example of, I think, us getting further out of touch. I run a public company. I don't know who my shareholders are. So there's this interesting phenomenon. I can know who follows me on Twitter down to the moment. I can know every Facebook friend I have in real time. As a public company, there's no mechanism for me to know who my shareholders are, except 3 months in the past. It seems like there are things about the transparency of markets, and you know, this is just one small example, but I think there are dozens of things where we're kind of stuck in a 1900s model, and if we're not careful about what we do both on the regulatory side as well as the technology side, we will fall further behind.
I would echo a little bit what Carl said just for a second, because, you know, going back to that story I said about coming here 25 years ago and the venture capital community being as strong and vibrant as it was 25 years ago, when you fast forward to today, my personal opinion, it's even stronger. not just the venture capital community, but the private equity communities. The opportunity for capital sits within a 40 square mile radius here. That's really unbelievable. And Carl's right, it's more of the administrators sometimes because that money is elsewhere, but the Mecca sits on Sand Hill, Page Mill, and other locations in this area. It's really amazing to watch. Still, this is the epicenter from that vantage point. Even if engineering isn't here anymore, the capital markets are for building companies, and that's impressive to watch.
David?
So I know a lot of you have seen Waiting for Superman, but what if there was some kind of drive to incorporate some of the suggestions in both the public employee and private unions about having the bottom, let's say 4 or 5% of workers be able to be, let's say, terminated every year, so that we could have greater productivity? How do you think that would help or not help, our economy? It's a question for everyone.
When I hear that, I think about my public companies, and I hope this doesn't come off wrong. Every year I terminate 4 to 5% of them anyway. Our sales force, our engineering teams, this is part of running strong companies. We're always hiring and we're always terminating because that's performance requirements. So, sorry? Yeah, I don't have union employees. Unfortunately, high tech, we don't have to deal with that as much, but the capital markets and our ability to execute allow us to do those types of cycles constantly, and we're always watching to do that.
Yeah, I'd say the one interesting, so I would think it's a good idea, but one of the interesting things in these public global companies, we look at other parts of the world as being much more restrictive, places like the EU, and we often get an allergic reaction to hiring more employees in places because it's impossible to terminate them for performance reasons. Exactly. Yeah. And so for us, it's incredibly expensive, and not having that freedom is something we try to avoid.
Years ago, I was a consultant before their current troubles to Portugal, and so you may or may not realize that Portugal, around the mid-70s, had a communist government. And it never was communist in the sense of the Soviet Union, but it had a communist government. But basically, they had this law that nobody could fire anybody, ever. And they thought this was going to really be great for workers. Well, it turned out that they ended up with a tremendous unemployment problem because people were incredibly careful about hiring anybody. And you can't fire anybody. And so it was very hard to get a job. But to answer your question, I think almost all private companies, I always thought of it as the General Electric way, that is, you're getting rid of your bottom employees, and that was something that GE did regularly, and many companies that I've been involved with have followed that idea. And I think if the public sector got rid of its underperformers, we'd have a much more efficient public sector.
I was going to say, it was a great question. We were actually talking about it over the break, exactly this film and the whole, the management problem in education, the reform system. One of the issues clearly is politically is the unions are very powerful, and Arnold Schwarzenegger's first move was to try and take on the teachers' unions, and it derailed him. Interestingly, one of the solutions that we're talking about is the whole choice for schools mechanism. It's a backdoor solution which is charter schools, for example, because charter schools a decade ago were really nothing, and charter schools, and they get around this system by basically not being unionized. And as the size of the charter school sector grows, it starts to put pressure on the rest of the sector. From my own perspective, I've seen it very directly in the UK. So the UK, I went through that management grid, was at the top. And the reason the UK is at the top is they've been very tough with school teachers and principals. So in the UK, I have several friends that are principals or senior in schools, and they do get fired, and they regularly get fired if they underperform, and so do teachers. And they also get very large bonuses, and that's pushed UK educational performance up a lot. So the best solution would be to bring in, relax the hiring and firing regulation. But another solution that's working behind the scenes really is the school choice movement and charter schools.
Sorry. implications of what seems certain to be a major deleveraging process in this country over the next decade. That combined with the loss of so many manufacturing jobs is really frightening. I mean, you know, when you travel around the Midwest, there are so many areas in the belt of Pennsylvania, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan that are barely hanging in there as it is. What is going to happen when, you know, when we do start deleveraging in a serious way?
You know, I relate to that. You know, having grown up where I grew up in, you know, heartland of Pennsylvania, I go back to visit there. It's amazing. I mean, it's a ghost town. There's practically nobody lives there anymore. Those who do can barely afford to live there. It's literally sad to watch what once was an extremely vibrant community be, you know, relegated to, you know, almost a skeleton at this point in time. But, you know, America has an amazing way of rebounding, and watching the spirit of the next generation who's growing up in a very tough environment. And I think somebody said this earlier, you know, when you look in California, maybe our children who are growing up much more privileged. I can tell you the children who are growing up in the coal regions of Pennsylvania aren't privileged. They're going to come back around with the eye of the tiger, that motivation again. I think we'll see another cycle. I'm hoping that happens. And that intangible of humankind hopefully comes back around. But it may take a while, but you know, that's at least what I see. Now the toughness is coming back to those communities like Detroit and other locations. Hopefully innovation comes with it.
You know, I don't see, on deleveraging, I don't see the governments as deleveraging. Unfortunately, the U.S. government debt continues to grow as a fraction of GDP, and probably will for the rest of the decade. The states, I don't see any massive deleveraging. The individual households, because of their underwater mortgages, there's a lot of deleveraging necessary there, and that's part of what we're talking about. And maybe the banking system will deleverage, and it's hard to stimulate the economy. Get a lot of bank loans when you're asking the banks to add capital and basically have very high lending standards. I think the banks, by the way, are getting very mixed messages. On the one hand, they're told, you know, let's have extra capital, let's be very careful. On the other hand, come on, lend some money. So it's just seems like it's a very mixed message that we're sending to the banks.
Great. Hi. Is there such a thing as a business cycle of economies versus of businesses? And can the U.S. have been most competitive, but lose that and move back to being most competitive, or is it a different narrative? Is the U.S. a part of a global economy, and it's time for emerging markets to be more competitive, and the U.S. plays a different role?
So I was, when you were asking the question, I was thinking a bit about, you know, an experience of another country that used to be the leading country in the world, and very much lost its position. So what happened with Britain, and it's a, you know, it's a good parable for the US. Britain was the leading country industrially. It was the most productive until about 1850, when something called the American System of Manufacturing came about. And the Americans were just smarter. They came up with an idea of making repeatable parts initially in guns and a whole lot of different industries. So the British would make one gun at a time, and the Americans would make 100. And why did the British fall behind? Well, you know, in part because the British were complacent. In part, there was the whole anti-education or, you know, anti-trying hard thing. My immediate family wasn't from a particularly good background, but going back, they were. They lost their money from kind of idiotic type of things, like not wanting to work hard. So what about America now? You know, so what about America now? The other thing that comes up a lot when I teach MBAs is the difference between, I guess, competitiveness and productivity. So Americans are definitely more productive than people in India and China. So the rough numbers you get out of the World Bank is controlling for inputs, an American will produce about 4 to 8 times as much per hour as, for example, an Indian or a Chinese. The issue is the wage rate gap is even larger. So, of course, if they're producing 4 times as much per hour but cost, you know, 8 times as much, you don't hire Americans. So in the short run, it's tough. As Indian and Chinese wages around the rest of the world catch up, America's position will become a bit easier. And the other issue is America, in order to stay at that top level of productivity, has to continue to be well managed, have good education systems, have free markets. So the things that have made America, I mean, coming back to what I said at the beginning, Americans still are the richest country in the world. They're the most productive. They can stay that way, in a sense, by having good policies. Other countries will close that gap. Whether they'll ever catch up with us or overtake us, as happened with the British, will depend on bad policies. The British problem ultimately was, they weren't pro-competitive, they weren't pro-education, they weren't very innovative, and they got overtaken. Unfortunately, I wish I should say.
By the way, there's a great website called 192021, and it's about 19 cities that will have more than 20 million in population in the 21st century. But what the graphic is that's used to be, I haven't looked at it lately, but it's very informative. It's kind of a timeline, and you slide a bar on the bottom, and it walks you through the last 1,000 years of what are the important cities. And as you go, and you realize that, just like companies, there's no inalienable right for a company to continue to exist. There's none for a city or a country to be great. And so you go looking back through this, and you see all these cities that are now tourist attractions. They're nothing. And we're looking at the vestiges of 300 years ago when they were great. And it's a real eye-opening experience that, where you realize that it's very easy to imagine that New York, just like London, will be a dated thing. And, and certainly when you go to places, you walk into Shanghai.
Not yet.
But when so my view is when I walk there, I look and I look at London and, it kind of reeks of 19th century. And I go to New York and it says 20th century. And I go to Shanghai and it says 21st century to me. And that doesn't mean that it can't reinvent itself, but left on its own. Just go look at this website, because you go back through the city, Genoa, the center of the world, Constantinople, the other great center of commerce. And you look where the great literary centers, educational centers, and commerce centers are, and they're not there anymore.
Lisbon was at its peak in the 16th century.
Exactly. You were consulting.
Okay. Oh, we have one over here? Okay.
In the last week, I've seen two presentations that I've kind of juxtaposed and put into the realm of economic speculation. The first was a year ago, the unemployment rate was about 10%, and now it's 9%. And you can find a complete explanation for the fall from 10% to 9% in the drop of the labor force participation rate. So, people dropping out of the workforce explains in its entirety the drop in the unemployment rate. The second was a presentation that asserted that families where both parents participated in the labor force, the children tended to underachieve. Families where no parents participated in the labor force, the children tended to underachieve, but a single parent in the labor force, relative to the other extremes, children tended to overachieve. Is there potentially a silver lining in declining labor force participation rate in the U.S.? And do you have any idea what the labor force participation rates in the U.S. look like relative to other countries?
What he said.
I defer to the economists.
I like it.
I mean, on the second point, I should say my wife doesn't work, so I'm hoping that our kids are. My suspicion is that much of it will be a cause as effect. I suspect people who neither parent work is a pretty bad situation. Where both parents work, often it will be out of desperation. Interestingly, for me, when I was in London. Sorry, I meant desperation as in if you're, two very low earning couples. Interesting for me, another cultural shift I noticed, London versus US, is in London, my entire peer group of everyone I went to university with, everyone worked on both sides. Moving to Stanford, I don't know if it's a Californian thing, but it was much more standard to have one parent working, one parent not working. So it's hard to say whether that's cause and effect. I debated a lot. My mother worked, so I was from a both working household. On the labor force participation, US rates are very high. So this is the other thing we were talking about in the break, was about Europe's, US's problem seems a lot of it's about healthcare costs rising into the future. And in fact, I was going to respond to John Garden's question about one of the things I think is really important for the political process is how to contain healthcare costs, because that's ultimately driving a lot of the budget problem. Europe's issue is much more about retirement. So if you go to Southern Europe, they retire at incredibly early ages, and therefore labor participation rates are very low. And the problem is there's just so few people earning to support the rest of the economy. The US actually looks pretty good. I'm again amazed when you go in the US, you'll see really quite young, really quite old people working in a way you just never see in Europe. That's a good thing. But do I link the 2 points together? It's not so obvious to me to link them together. But I think the US benefits from high labor force participation rates. That's definitely helping us.
So I'm going to use this as an excuse to mention my hobby horse, which is that I believe that around the world, particularly in the developed countries of Europe and the United States, that we are trying to do something that is essentially impossible. That is, we're trying to finance 30-year retirements with 40-year careers. And it just won't work. And I think it's behind a lot of the budget problems that we're seeing. And the reason that we're seeing it now instead of 10 years ago is 10 years ago the baby boomers were in their 40s and 50s, and there weren't that many retirees because the people that were of retirement age were the very few that were born in the Great Depression and World War II. The demographics have really changed, and now it's kind of obvious that the way we're dividing life between work and retirement just won't work. It just can't, I don't think it can be sustained. And I don't think it's a problem of Social Security, or I don't think it's a problem of 401k accounts or pension design. It's just that, just think about it in your own life. If you're going to work for 40 years, and how are you going to finance yourself for 30 more years after that? And yet, many people who retire at 60, or say, and say they're a married couple, the last to die of that couple is easily going to be around for another 30 years. So we are really trying to do 30-year retirements with 40-year careers, and it won't work. So I think what we have to think about changing all of our retirement institutions. Encourage, so we may have 50-year careers and 20-year retirements. But I just think something has to give. And I don't think that the Stanford students today are going to be able to retire at 55 or 58 or 62. But 70 would be a good guess. By the way, I was pretty surprised when Governor Brown, you must have read the story, said that new California employees, he wanted them to retire at 67 instead of 55. I thought for the first time, hey, he's onto something.
For the first time.
In case you can't hear me from here.
No, they can't hear you.
Yeah. So relative to healthcare, you mentioned healthcare costs. For the economists, what is the right percentage of GDP or some other, or whatever measure you want to take it to spend on healthcare? We have people live longer. We have more better medicine. We spend a lot more on computers today than we did 50 years ago too. Sure. So why isn't healthcare considered a good? That is, the more of it you want, the more of it you should, the more you should pay for. Why is it kind of picked out solely and picked on as something that you should get more of for less?
It's a great point. So one issue is that there is a big debate about what the right level of healthcare is, and that will rise as we get wealthier. So the economics terminology is healthcare is a luxury good in the sense that as you get rich, you want to spend more and more on it. The question I think for the US is what that right level is. and how it grows over time. And just empirically, if you look at the US, it's right at the top of the range across countries. So the US spends right now about 18% of GDP on healthcare. The UK, and it's a country I know very well, most of my family in the NHS are on about 9%. Health outcomes, amazingly, aren't that dissimilar across the two countries. What are we getting for the extra 9%? Primarily, people like us are getting fantastic healthcare, whereas the bottom end of the distribution in the US is getting very bad healthcare, and therefore the outcomes don't look as good. The other issue is not only is it high, but it's rising very rapidly. The US is not only the highest level, it's rising the most rapidly right now. And I think a lot of the problems are over-treatment. So again, you know, something I've seen personally, I was amazed. Going to the NHS, you have to wring the doctor's neck to get anything out of the guy. And that's after he's put you off for 6 months to see him. Whereas you go to the doctor here, or the dentist, he tries to give you 20 x-rays, and we're trying to, you know, stay away. So the issue here is the system, I think, endemically generates over-treatment. The incentives to over-treat, the incentives to overbill mean that I suspect the current level is too high. And certainly the growth rates, if you forecast it forwards. I was looking at some data earlier in the week that, you know, it's over 100% of GDP by 2015. Obviously, that's ridiculous. It's never going to get there. But you can see that the growth rates are pretty high. And once it gets above 25%. So like retirement, you just know it can't go on forever. I agree, upwards is the right measure. And, you know, I heard the Ryan plan was GDP plus 1%. That may be about right. I mean, again, I don't vote, so I don't want to make a political statement. It's going to go up with GDP. It's just slower than it is now, and the current level may be higher than what you'd like.
So it's partly the legal system, you know, malpractice, and it's partly the payment system.
The payment system. I was talking to Palo Alto Medical Foundation is a part of Suter Healthcare, and I was talking to a friend of ours that works in Palo Alto Medical Foundation. She gave me a great example of a problem, which is she's an internal medicine practitioner. She gets paid per visit. Often patients come in and they have health tests done, at which the answer is very fast. So they could email her or give her a phone call, and she'd give them the answer over the phone by email. But does she get paid for it? No. She knows, hand on heart, it's inefficient to bring them in. Does she bring them in? She said yes, because that's what basically I get rewarded on. That's a classic example, and the whole system is replete with that, which makes me think expenditure levels are probably too high. But I mean, John knows.
Well, I agree with the spirit of your question that I think healthcare probably is a luxury good, and as we get richer, we would want to spend more. But I also think, you know, this fee-for-service system is pretty elementary, got some incentive problems. If I'm going to get a fee for service, I'm going to ask for a lot of services. One more MRI scan, one more of this, one more of that. And I think there's a lot of evidence that of overtreatment, as he said, or that the marginal care doesn't give you much health, increased health. We should not conflate health spending and health. And I think the connection is pretty weak at the margin. I once had a student who looked at a particular cancer, which was colon cancer, and looked at patients that were treated differently. With colon cancer, the typical treatment is to cut the tumor out, right? It's surgical is the first treatment. And then looked at follow-on procedures such as chemotherapy and radiation. And at least in that particular cancer, it looked like there was no improved 5-year survival with all this extra treatment. And that basically the surgery was the solution. But there seemed to be a lot of extra treatment because, who knows, well, you can't get sued for overtreatment or something like that. You know, it's getting close to bedtime. One more question? Okay, one more question, and then we'll
Hi, is it
call
Carl,
it an evening.
Autodesk? You were saying in your opening remarks about the transition within your own firm, and I don't remember the numbers exactly, but I think you were saying something like the firm had grown to 3,000 people, and it started with 1,000 in California, and then now it's at 800. This point seemed to be that the firm had grown, and the jobs had been mostly offshore, and that the number of jobs in California had declined. And I thought, this kind of is the greatest case study of what we're talking about tonight. And I thought, could you just talk about, do those jobs go offshore because that's where the demand was and that's where the new markets were and you were hiring sales guys out there? Or was it they were cheaper engineers? Just kind of the dynamics of what caused that offshore growth, and in the context of getting jobs back to the US, is there anything that would move those back to California? Is it you know, if you did X, Y, Z, or you know what, there's no way I pay guys in Bangalore $2 and then US they want 50 and it's just never going to happen. I mean, just anything, any thoughts on
Sure.
that?
I'll start since I used the analogy with McAfee, but Carl, I'm sure, has similar stories to tell with Autodesk and other companies. I mean, what we ended up seeing was when we first got to the company, or at least I did, 1,000 employees, largely centered in Santa Clara, and the goal there was to really get a lot more capacity into the organization. The best way for me to get capacity into the organization, both engineering and sales capacity, was leverage human capital outside of California from a cost point of view. And the talent was there. So what I could do was hire 3 or 4 engineers in India or Eastern Europe or Chile, as I used that example, and I could triple my capacity for engineering for products. It was a cost-driven equation. The governments in those countries would subsidize the cost as well, even making it more attractive to do. And we even put in operations like support and telesales operations outside the US, again, because of cost. Hardworking desire was just much greater. The number of hours we got out of those employees and the productivity we got out of those employers were just that much great. So the California employee base shrank, and the company doubled and tripled in employee count around the world. So it was straight problem of desire to work, the cost variable, and the government subsidy kinds of models. And now I'm sitting here with 800 employees at 8,000 versus what could have been thousands out of 8,000.
Yeah. So I would say I've seen a very similar thing going on, in which our initial reason for offshoring, particularly research and development, high-paying technical jobs offshore, was one of cost. And it was a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 kind of equation. The thing we found out was closer to Dave's point about desire. So for example, in San Francisco, we're down at one market. Competition for jobs is there. We talked about the immigration problem. By contrast, in China, we would post jobs and would have 200 to 300 applicants per job. They would all have two degrees at a minimum. You couldn't even get past the first filter without a CS degree and a mechanical engineering degree. And as Dave said, figuratively and literally, they would stand outside all day. They'd come in Saturday, Sunday, take IQ tests, personality tests, and were willing to do almost anything, particularly, as you learn the cultural thing, for many families and extended families, this one child was going to be the source of success. I mean, it was going to up the living standard of an entire family. Now, what's interesting is our move to China really started about 10 years ago. And we have 25 R&D sites around the world, Eastern Europe, China, Singapore. What's interesting now, for the first time, as the wages rise, and I think someone in the audience mentioned this, all of a sudden you start seeing this equilibrium. 4-for-1 no longer exists. So we went there first for cost, then we went there for talent. Now what we're finding out is the costs are equalizing, and so it's really just a source for talent. And I don't think we're very far off. If you look right now, wages in the US for many technical people are relatively stagnant, and in places around the world, they're growing at 20 to 25% a year. So you don't have to be a mathematician to say, in the near future, we're going to do it. And I think that's the biggest hope, because there is certainly an overhead in managing distributed organizations, in the coordination and quality of work. And so I think it will become a real battle just for talent and productivity and effectiveness, much less so for pure cost.
What's going to hold it back for a little while longer is if the U.S. government's policies don't change. We're finding that the competition of countries around the world to do subsidies will keep that balance out of balance, because yes, the cost is equalizing, but the subsidy models are not. So that will slow that process down a little bit. Ireland has their IDA, their Irish Development Agencies. Chile has theirs. You see in Vietnam very aggressive right now. The Russian CIS markets are very aggressive. So you're seeing almost free labor opportunities that keep the cost very low and the motivation very high. And we haven't exploited that globally yet, not all of it. So it's going to take a while longer.
Yeah, one really interesting thing that I've seen that's very depressing is there's been this whole debate about the repatriation of offshore profits, and everybody gets into this thing about whether or not people are anticipating it, and if businesses plan on it happening at some point in the future, they behave a certain way. What we're seeing is one of those perverse unintended consequences. Managers in my company come to me and say, because we're always looking to do acquisitions, 85% of our cash is offshore. So people now look at buying offshore companies as if they had a 30% discount. So someone will come to me and say, I have a choice. I can buy a company in Wichita that has 35 engineers, and I can buy one in Switzerland. And they say, that one I'm going to buy with the 30 or 35% discount. And so we're creating really good jobs offshore. I mean, just to put a fine point on this, the U.S., I think there's one other country in the world, and I think it's like in Africa, that does double taxation on corporate profits. So we're one of 2 countries in the world. My French competitors, my German competitors, they pay tax in one place and they pay it in one place only. And that's why when people add up the hundreds of billions, approaching trillions of dollars that are offshore from corporations, that's why people don't bring it back. But everyone thinks it's this little political shell game, but the consequences are real, in which we continue to have motivation for creating jobs offshore.
So,
go ahead. I don't want to be a smart ass, but you guys were saying earlier that these policy things don't have a big effect on your business, but now as I listen to it more, it sounds like it has a big effect.
No, so you got to parse that a little bit finely.
Yeah.
It has a huge effect on America. Right. These are the 2 companies I'm considering buying. They're 2 good competitors. They both do a good job. They have excellent products. We'll buy the technology. We'll integrate it. It'll be successful for us as a company. Huge consequences for the country, less so for the company.
So, I mean, what I'm hearing, and I think I've experienced, is the labor markets for talented individuals in India and China are quite hot, and their cost advantages are less than they were. And so you can imagine firms hiring more in the United States. I think California continues to have a problem. I mean, we heard about the fab in Oregon. As Wade knows, Cadence took its back office and put it in Utah. Another company I know has some of its operations in Arizona. So I think even in the U.S. labor market, California's having a tough time competing.
Yeah. No doubt. Great.
Okay, with that cheery note, thanks a lot.